Look at any American city from above, and one thing immediately stands out. Not skyscrapers, not highways, parking lots. Miles of asphalt surrounding homes, offices, malls, and even downtown cores. This isn't accidental design. It's not laziness. It's the result of decades of planning decisions, economic incentives, political choices, and cultural values that quietly reshaped American cities. Today, we're uncovering why American cities are built around parking and what this says about power, money, and urban life in the United States.
The city designed for the car. American cities were not always like this. In the early 20th century, cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston were dense, walkable, and built around streetcars and railways. Streets were shared spaces. People walked. Shops sat close together. Then came the automobile. At first, cars were rare and disruptive. They clashed with pedestrians, horses, and streetcars. But instead of limiting cars, cities began to redesign themselves around them. The street stopped being a public space. It became a traffic system. And once cars became dominant, one question changed everything. Where do we put them when they stop moving? Parking as a problem. By the 1920s and 1930s, American cities faced a crisis. Cars were everywhere. They blocked streets, they crowded sidewalks, they disrupted business. Parking was framed as an emergency. City planners did not ask whether cars should dominate cities. They assumed they would. The only question was how to accommodate them. The solution was simple, brutal, and permanent. Remove buildings, flatten land, and store cars. Parking lots were not seen as waste. They were seen as progress. Zoning laws that changed everything. The real explosion of parking did not come from demand alone. It came from law. After World War II, American cities adopted minimum parking requirements. These rules forced developers to build a specific number of parking spaces for every building: apartments, restaurants, offices, churches, schools. The law assumed everyone would arrive by car. If you wanted to build housing, you had to build parking. If you wanted to open a store, you had to sacrifice land for cars. Parking was no longer optional. It was mandatory. This single policy reshaped the American landscape more than almost any other planning decision. Suburbs, sprawl, and the death of density. After World War II, millions of Americans moved to the suburbs. Federal housing loans encouraged single-family homes. Highways connected suburbs to city centers. Public transit was neglected. Suburbs were built far apart. Walking became impractical. Driving became necessary. And every destination needed parking. Malls replaced main streets, each surrounded by oceans of asphalt. Offices spread horizontally, not vertically. The result was sprawl, low-density development that consumes massive amounts of land just to function. Parking became the invisible foundation of suburban life. Parking lots as architectural void. From an architectural perspective, parking lots are negative space. They produce no culture, no social interaction, no identity. They separate buildings instead of connecting them. In many American downtowns, historic neighborhoods were demolished, not for buildings, but for empty space to store cars. Parking lots create heat islands. They increase flooding. They discourage walking. Yet they dominate the urban fabric. They are architecture without intention, space without meaning. The economic illusion of free parking. Parking is never free. Its cost is hidden in rent, housing prices, food, and taxes. When cities force developers to build parking, the cost is passed to everyone, even people who do not drive. Parking lots also destroy value. A downtown parking lot generates less economic activity than housing, offices, or shops. It weakens cities financially while occupying prime land. But for decades, parking was treated as essential infrastructure, untouchable and unquestioned. Why this is mostly an American story. Other countries faced cars too, but they chose different priorities. European and Asian cities invested in public transit. They limited parking. They preserved density. American cities chose convenience over cohesion, speed over space, cars over people. Parking lots are not just infrastructure. They are cultural artifacts. They reflect a belief system that mobility matters more than place. A slow shift in urban thinking. Today, some American cities are changing. Minimum parking laws are being removed. Parking lots are being redeveloped into housing and mixed-use spaces. Cities are rediscovering density. But the legacy remains. Millions of acres of land are still devoted to parked cars. The shape of American cities is still defined by decisions made decades ago. Parking lots are the physical memory of a car-first era.
The city you see is a choice. American cities did not end up this way by accident. They were designed, regulated, enforced. Parking lots tell a story about priorities, fear, convenience, and control. They remind us that cities are not natural, they are choices. And if cities were designed once for cars, they can be redesigned again for people. This is architecture history. When you look at your city now, do you see buildings or parking? Tell us in the comments, what would you replace parking lots with if your city had the choice?
Parking minimums, when empty space became mandatory. By the mid-20th century, parking was no longer just a response to cars. It became a legal requirement. Cities across the United States introduced what are known as parking minimums, zoning rules that forced developers to provide a specific number of parking spaces for every building they constructed. An apartment building? You must build parking. A restaurant? Parking required. A church, a school, a hospital, even a small corner shop, parking was mandatory. These rules were written into zoning codes quietly, often without public debate, but their impact would permanently reshape American cities. Parking minimums were based on peak demand assumptions, the busiest possible moment. A shopping center had to provide enough parking for Black Friday, not for a normal Tuesday. The result was predictable. Most parking lots were empty most of the time, yet cities kept requiring more. Over decades, this created an urban landscape where empty space dominated built space. Parking minimums did not just respond to car culture, they reinforced it. By making parking abundant and free, cities made driving the easiest option. Walking, cycling, and public transit became less practical by comparison. The city began to stretch outward. The economics of asphalt. Parking lots may look simple, but they carry enormous economic consequences. Every parking space has a cost. In the United States, a single surface parking space can cost thousands of dollars to build. Structured parking can cost tens of thousands per space. Those costs are rarely visible. They are embedded in rent, in food prices, in housing costs, in taxes. Even people who do not own cars still pay for parking. Parking minimums force developers to spend money on space that does not generate value. A parking lot does not produce rent. It does not house people. It does not create jobs. It simply stores vehicles. This has made American cities less dense, more expensive, and less efficient. Small businesses are hit especially hard. A cafe that could thrive in a compact space is often impossible to build because zoning requires more parking than the business can afford. In many cities, it is illegal to build a modest building without a large parking lot. As a result, entire neighborhoods remain underdeveloped, not because there is no demand, but because parking rules make development financially impossible. Parking and the loss of urban life. Cities are not just collections of buildings, they are places of interaction. Historically, streets were social spaces. Markets, conversations, movement, and daily life happened close together. Parking lots disrupt this pattern. They create distance. They break continuity. They turn walking into an unpleasant experience. A person walking through a parking lot is exposed to heat, traffic, and emptiness. There are no windows, no doors, no human activity. Urban planners call this dead space. In many American downtowns, parking lots occupy the most valuable land, right where activity should be highest. Instead of cafes, homes, or public squares, there is asphalt. This has profound psychological effects. People feel that cities are hostile, boring, or unsafe, not because of crime, but because there is nothing to engage with at street level. The dominance of parking has hollowed out the emotional core of many American cities. Why Europe looks different. To understand why American cities look the way they do, it helps to compare them with European cities. Most European cities were built before the automobile. Their streets were designed for people, carts, and later public transit. When cars arrived, cities adapted, but they did not surrender completely. Parking exists in Europe, but it is limited, expensive, and often hidden underground. Driving is not the default choice for every trip. As a result, European cities remain compact, dense, and walkable. In the United States, many cities were either rebuilt or expanded during the automobile era. They were designed around cars from the beginning. This difference is not cultural alone, it is architectural and regulatory. Zoning laws, parking minimums, and road design locked American cities into a car-dependent model. Once built, that model became difficult to escape. The environmental cost of parking. Parking lots are not just a spatial problem, they are an environmental one. Large asphalt surfaces absorb heat, creating urban heat islands. They increase temperatures in cities by several degrees. Parking lots also worsen flooding. Rainwater cannot soak into asphalt. Instead, it runs off into drains, overwhelming infrastructure and polluting waterways. Cars themselves produce emissions, but parking infrastructure amplifies the environmental footprint of driving. Cities with more parking encourage more driving. More driving leads to more emissions.
This cycle is deeply embedded in the physical form of American cities. The quiet revolution, removing parking minimums. In recent years, something remarkable has begun to happen. Cities across the United States have started removing parking minimums. Minneapolis, Buffalo, San Jose, Portland. These cities recognized that parking rules were doing more harm than good. When parking minimums are removed, developers build differently. Buildings become smaller, denser, and more affordable. Streets become more active. Public transit becomes more viable. Importantly, parking does not disappear. It becomes optional. Market demand, not outdated regulations, determines how much parking is built. This shift represents a fundamental change in how cities think about space. Parking as a reflection of values. Parking lots are not accidental. They reflect what a society values. For decades, American cities valued speed, convenience, and individual mobility above all else. The built environment followed those priorities. But values can change. As cities face climate change, housing shortages, and social fragmentation, the question becomes unavoidable. How much space should we give to cars, and how much to people? Parking lots tell the story of a century of decisions. Understanding them helps us imagine different futures. The city beneath the asphalt. American cities did not become parking lots by accident. They were shaped by history, policy, economics, and belief. Parking lots are the physical evidence of a car-centered era, an era that is now being questioned. Beneath the asphalt lies the possibility of something else. Denser neighborhoods, livelier streets, cities designed for human life, not just vehicle storage. The future of American cities may depend on what we choose to build next and what we choose not to. This is architecture history. If you look at your own city, how much space is dedicated to parking? Could that space be something else? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're watching from.
The rise of the 20th century and the death of the walkable city. By the early 20th century, American cities stood at a turning point. They were dense, noisy, crowded, and alive. People walked, they took streetcars, they lived close to where they worked. But one invention would quietly begin to reshape everything. The automobile. America before cars, cities built for humans. Before cars dominated the streets, American cities looked very different. Downtowns were compact. Buildings stood shoulder to shoulder. Streets were narrow, shared spaces. Most people lived within walking distance of their jobs, shops, schools, markets, places of worship. Public transportation, especially streetcars and rail, defined urban growth. Cities like New York,
To understand why American cities have so many parking lots, we must look at the rules that made them inevitable. Zoning laws, parking minimums, and the system that locked cities in place. By the mid-20th century, the automobile had already reshaped American life. But what truly cemented parking lots into the DNA of American cities was not culture, not consumer demand, but law. Invisible rules, written into zoning codes, quietly shaping every building, every street, every city block. This is where parking stops being a choice and becomes a requirement. The birth of parking minimums. In the 1940s and 1950s, American cities faced a new problem. Cars were everywhere, streets were crowded, curbside parking was overflowing. City planners believed they had found a solution. Instead of letting cars spill into public streets, every new building would be required to provide its own parking. This idea sounded logical.
even responsible. And so a new rule was born: parking minimums. For every apartment, for every restaurant, for every office, for every store, a fixed number of parking spaces was legally required, not optional, mandatory. No parking, no permit, no building. How parking minimums actually work. Here is how the system operates. A zoning code might say 1 parking space per apartment unit, 1 parking space per 300 square feet of retail, 1 parking space per classroom, 1 parking space per hospital bed. These numbers are not based on science. They are not based on long-term data. Many were copied from other cities. Some were guessed. Others were influenced by traffic engineers and real estate interests. Once written into law, they became almost impossible to remove. Every new project, no matter how small, had to obey them. Why parking minimums create parking lots everywhere? Parking minimums have one unavoidable outcome. They force land to be used for cars instead of people. If a restaurant wants to open on a small lot, but the zoning code requires 20 parking spaces, the building shrinks, the parking grows. If an apartment developer wants to build affordable housing, but must include parking, construction costs rise, rents increase, density decreases. In many cases, the parking lot becomes larger than the building itself, not because people asked for it, but because the law demanded it. The death of walkable neighborhoods. Before parking minimums, cities grew organically. Shops next to homes, schools near streets, daily life within walking distance. Parking minimums broke this pattern. Buildings were pushed farther apart, lots expanded, distances grew. Suddenly, walking became inconvenient, public transit became inefficient, and the car became unavoidable. This created a vicious cycle. More driving, more parking demand. More parking, less walkability. Less walkability, more driving. Cities didn't just adapt to cars, they were redesigned to depend on them. Parking as a hidden tax. Here is a fact rarely discussed. Parking is not free. Even when you do not drive, even when you do not own a car, parking costs are built into everything. Higher rent, higher grocery prices, higher construction costs, higher taxes. A single parking space can cost $5,000 to $10,000 on the surface, $30,000 to $60,000 in a garage, over $100,000 underground. Those costs are passed on to everyone. Parking minimums act as a hidden tax on cities, a tax that disproportionately affects low-income residents, renters, non-drivers. Yet it remains invisible. Why America kept doubling down? So why didn't cities stop? Because once parking minimums existed, everything adapted around them. Banks expected parking. Developers planned for parking. Politicians feared removing parking. Any attempt to reduce parking was framed as anti-business or anti-driver. Parking became politically untouchable, not because it worked, but because everyone assumed it was necessary. The sprawl machine. Parking minimums did more than create lots. They fueled sprawl. Large parking requirements made small lots impossible to develop, so development moved outward. Land was cheaper, parking was easier, driving was mandatory. Suburbs exploded, cities stretched, infrastructure costs soared. American cities didn't spread naturally. They were stretched by regulation. What this did to city identity. Parking lots erased character. Historic fronts were demolished. Dense blocks were replaced with asphalt. Public life retreated indoors. Downtowns became hollow. Cities lost their sense of place. Many American cities today feel interchangeable. Same roads, same parking lots, same buildings. This is not accidental. It is the visual outcome of zoning laws written decades ago. The irony no one talks about. Despite all this parking, many American cities still claim they don't have enough. Why? Because parking creates more driving, and more driving creates more demand for parking.
No amount is ever enough. Parking minimums do not solve congestion. They amplify it. Quiet revolution beginning. In recent years, something changed. Some cities began questioning the rules. They asked, what if parking wasn't mandatory? What if buildings could decide? What if cities prioritized people again? This question threatens the entire system. And that is where our story goes next. American cities did not choose parking lots. They were required to build them, by law. In the next part, we'll explore how parking reshapes daily life, culture, and inequality, and why its impact goes far beyond urban design.
Parking lots as urban power and control. By the mid-20th century, parking lots were no longer just a response to cars. They became a system of power, quietly shaping American cities without public debate. Parking was not neutral. It dictated who could access the city, how long they could stay, and what kind of life was possible there. To understand why American cities are covered in parking, we must look at who benefited from it and who didn't. Parking as a tool of exclusion. In theory, parking was about convenience. In reality, it often worked as a gatekeeper. When zoning laws required every business, apartment, and store to provide parking, they quietly raised the cost of development. More land, more concrete, more money. This made small, local, and affordable projects nearly impossible to build. Parking requirements favored large developers, big retail chains, suburban-style construction, and they punished density. The hidden cost of parking minimums. Every parking space takes up land. In cities, land is expensive. When a city requires parking, developers must buy larger plots, build fewer housing units, raise rents and prices. Parking doesn't come free. Its cost is embedded into everything you buy and rent. Even people without cars pay for parking through higher housing costs and higher prices. Parking became an invisible tax. Why American downtowns lost density? Before the rise of parking mandates, downtowns were compact and vertical. After parking rules, buildings became shorter, blocks became wider, streets became emptier. Parking lots replaced apartments, theaters, local shops, historic buildings. This process hollowed out cities from the inside. Downtowns stopped being places to live and became places to drive to. The dead zone effect. Parking lots are active only for short periods, during work hours, during events, during shopping peaks. The rest of the time, they are empty. This creates what urban planners call dead zones. No people, no street life, no safety through activity. The city becomes fragmented, islands of buildings separated by oceans of asphalt. Parking and racial segregation. Parking policy also played a role in reinforcing racial and economic separation. After World War II, highways cut through minority neighborhoods. Parking lots replaced dense communities. Suburban access was prioritized over urban residents. Many Black and immigrant neighborhoods were labeled blighted, then demolished to make room for roads and parking. This was not accidental. Parking supported suburban commuters, white flight, car-owning populations, and it displaced communities that depended on walking, transit, and proximity. Urban renewal and parking. Urban renewal projects often followed the same pattern. Declare an area underutilized, demolish existing buildings, replace them with parking or car-oriented development. Entire neighborhoods disappeared. Parking became a symbol of progress, even when it destroyed living communities. Parking lots and the economic of convenience. In American culture, convenience is king. Parking promised instant access, minimal walking, predictable routines. Retailers believed customers would only come if parking was abundant. This shaped shopping centers, malls, downtown redevelopment. But research later showed something surprising. The parking myth. Studies found that most customers arrived by walking, transit, or short trips. Businesses overestimated how many customers drove. Parking lots were rarely full. Yet parking requirements remained. Why? Because parking felt necessary, even when data suggested otherwise. Fear replaced evidence. The psychology of parking. Parking is not just infrastructure, it is psychology. In the American mind, driving equals freedom, parking equals access, lack of parking equals failure. Politicians feared backlash, developers feared rejection, cities feared losing shoppers, so parking stayed, even when it hurt the city. How parking shaped architecture. Parking didn't just reshape streets, it reshaped buildings themselves. Architects had to design around cars, podium parking garages, blank concrete facades, buildings pulled away from sidewalks. The result? Less human-scale design, fewer street-level interactions, cities designed for vehicles, not people. Architecture lost intimacy. Parking podiums and urban scale. Many American buildings hide parking inside their base. This creates inactive ground floors, fewer shops and cafes, less visual interest. Cities feel colder, larger, and less welcoming. The building becomes an object, not part of the street. Why parking was never questioned. For decades, parking policy remained untouched. Why? Because it was embedded in zoning codes, it benefited powerful interests, it aligned with car culture. Parking was seen as common sense. Few asked, what if this is wrong? The first cracks in the system.
By the late 20th century, problems became obvious. Cities noticed declining downtowns, rising housing costs, empty parking lots. Urban planners began to question, why are we designing cities for cars that aren't always there? This question changed everything. Transition to the next chapter. Parking lots once symbolized progress. Now they symbolize inefficiency. They consume land, they weaken cities, they disconnect people. In the next part, we will explore how cities began fighting back, why parking reform became controversial, and how America's parking future is being rewritten. This is not just about cars. It is about who cities are built for.
Zoning laws, minimum parking requirements, and the spread of asphalt. By the mid-20th century, cars had already reshaped American cities. But what truly locked parking lots into the urban landscape was not culture alone. It was law. Parking did not spread accidentally. It was mandated. When parking became a legal requirement. Starting in the 1940s and accelerating in the 1950s and 1960s, American cities began rewriting their zoning codes. These codes dictated what could be built, where it could be built, how tall it could be, and critically, how much parking it must include. This is when minimum parking requirements were born. Instead of letting developers decide how much parking they needed, cities imposed rules like 1 parking space per apartment, 1 space per hotel room, 3 to 5 spaces per 1,000 square feet of retail, dozens of spaces for churches, schools, offices, and restaurants. Parking was no longer optional. It was compulsory. Even if the market didn't need it, even if public transit existed, even if land was scarce. Why cities chose minimum parking? City officials believed they were solving a problem. In the early days of car ownership, street parking chaos was common. Cars clogged curbs, traffic slowed, residents complained. The solution seemed logical. If every building provides enough parking on site, streets will stay clear. But this logic ignored one critical fact. Parking supply creates parking demand. When parking is abundant, cheap, and mandatory, people drive more. The rules intended to reduce congestion quietly guaranteed it. How zoning transformed urban form. Minimum parking requirements didn't just add parking, they reshaped entire cities. Buildings had to shrink or move back to make room for parking lots. Street-facing storefronts gave way to setbacks and driveways. Historic, dense urban patterns became illegal to reproduce. In many cities, a small cafe could not open without dozens of parking spaces. A mixed-use building was impossible to approve. Apartments without parking were banned outright. Parking regulations silently outlawed walkable urbanism. The mathematical explosion of parking. 1 parking space typically requires about 300 square feet for the space itself, plus circulation, ramps, and access lanes. In practice, each space consumes 350 to 400 square feet. Now multiply that. A suburban shopping center with 1,000 spaces consumes more land for parking than for buildings. In some American cities, parking occupies more land than housing, more land than parks, more land than offices and retail combined. The city becomes a landscape of asphalt with buildings scattered across it. Parking as a hidden subsidy. Parking feels free, but it is not. The cost of building and maintaining parking is hidden in higher rents, in higher housing prices, in higher consumer costs. Every apartment includes parking costs, even if residents don't own cars. Every store pays for parking through rent, even if customers arrive on foot. In effect, non-drivers subsidize drivers. This hidden subsidy reinforced car dominance for decades. The feedback loop of car dependency. Minimum parking requirements created a powerful feedback loop. More parking, more driving. More driving, demand for wider roads. Wider roads, destinations spread farther apart. Spread out destinations, need for more parking. The city stretches outward. Walking becomes impractical. Transit becomes inefficient. At that point, parking is no longer a convenience. It becomes a necessity created by the system itself. Why American cities look so empty? To visitors, many American cities feel strangely empty. Not because people aren't there, but because space is wasted. Between every building, parking lots, access roads, buffer zones. Density is diluted. Where European cities concentrate activity into compact streets, American cities disperse it across vast surfaces of asphalt. Parking lots are not neutral spaces. They erase urban life. The architectural cost of parking. Architecture suffers under parking mandates. Buildings are designed around garages instead of streets. Ground floors become dead zones. Facades turn blank and defensive. Parking structures dominate skylines and streetscapes, often contributing nothing to public life. The city loses visual richness, human scale, architectural continuity. Parking becomes the primary urban form. Parking and the death of the corner store. Before parking mandates, small businesses thrived in compact spaces. But when zoning required large parking lots, small lots became unusable. Historic buildings became non-compliant. Redevelopment favored big chains. Only businesses that could afford large parcels survived. Parking regulations quietly outlawed local urban economies. A system designed for cars, not people.
By the late 20th century, American cities were no longer designed for humans. They were optimized for vehicle storage. Parking lots became
the dominant land use, the invisible backbone of urban planning, a permanent feature of American life. And yet, almost no one voted for this outcome. It emerged from technical rules, written quietly and forced universally. Parking lots and the American way of life. Expanded authority version. By the mid-20th century, parking lots were no longer just an urban solution. They had become a reflection of the American way of life. To understand why American cities are filled with parking, we must look beyond engineering and planning. We must look at culture. Because parking lots did not spread only because cars existed, they spread because American society was redesigned around the automobile. In the United States, the car was never treated as a simple tool. It became an extension of personal freedom, identity, and success. And parking was the silent infrastructure that made this possible. The car as freedom. In American culture, mobility has always carried deep meaning. From the frontier era to westward expansion, movement symbolized opportunity. The ability to go where you want, when you want, without permission. When automobiles became affordable, they perfectly matched this cultural mindset. Unlike trains or buses, cars required no schedules, no shared space, no waiting. The car promised independence. But independence required storage. A city built around freedom of movement needed places where vehicles could wait patiently while their owners lived their lives. Parking lots became the physical footprint of freedom. The garage comes first. In many American suburbs, the garage became the most important part of the house. In fact, modern suburban homes are often designed from the garage outward. Wide driveways, front-facing garages, minimal front porches. This design tells a story. The house is no longer oriented toward the street or community. It is oriented toward the car. The car arrives first. The person follows. When this logic is scaled up to the city level, parking becomes unavoidable. Shopping centers, office parks, schools, churches. Every destination assumes arrival by car. And every arrival requires space. Retail, parking, and consumption. American retail culture played a massive role in expanding parking. In the mid-20th century, shopping moved away from dense downtowns into suburban malls and big-box stores. These businesses were designed for drivers. Wide roads, large entrances, free parking. Parking was not a side feature, it was a selling point. Free parking told customers, come anytime, stay as long as you want, spend freely. Unlike older cities where limited space discouraged driving, American retail used parking to attract it. The more parking you provided, the more customers you could serve. As a result, parking lots around shopping centers often became larger than the buildings themselves. Parking as economic insurance. Developers and city officials began to see parking as a form of economic safety. If there is not enough parking, customers might not come. If customers do not come, businesses fail. If businesses fail, cities lose tax revenue. This logic led to excessive caution. Instead of building just enough parking, cities built more than enough. Empty parking spaces were seen as safer than full ones. This mindset created cities with massive amounts of unused asphalt most of the time, except during peak hours. Yet the cost of this overbuilding was rarely questioned. The invisible cost of parking. Parking feels free to drivers. But it is one of the most expensive infrastructure a city can build. Land, construction, maintenance, drainage, lighting. All of it cost money. Yet because parking is rarely priced directly, the cost is hidden. It is baked into higher rents, higher prices, lower density neighborhoods. Parking makes cities more expensive, even for people who do not drive. This creates a silent inequality. Those who own cars benefit most. Those who do not still pay the price. Why parking feels normal in America? In many parts of the world, large surface parking lots feel strange or inefficient. In the United States, they feel normal. This is because generations grew up with them. Children learn to walk across parking lots before walking city streets. Teenagers learn to drive before learning public transit. Adults learn to associate convenience with distance.
Parking lots became part of the visual language of American cities. They stopped being noticed. When something becomes invisible, it stops being questioned. Parking and the loss of urban life. One of the greatest consequences of parking dominance is what it replaces. Parking lots replace housing, small businesses, public space, walkable streets. They create distance where closeness once existed. In older American cities, many neighborhoods were dismantled to make room for parking. Entire blocks were cleared. What replaced them was not buildings, but emptiness. Asphalt does not create street life. It does not generate community. It does not tell stories. It simply waits.
A city designed for machines. At its core, excessive parking reveals a deeper truth. Many American cities are designed less for people and more for vehicles. Distances are long. Sidewalks are optional. Public transit is secondary. Parking is not the problem. It is the symptom. A symptom of a system that prioritized speed, convenience, and private ownership over density, efficiency, and shared space. Why this matters today. As cities face climate change, housing shortages, and rising costs, parking is being re-examined. What once symbolized freedom now consumes valuable land. What once enabled growth now limits it. Many cities are asking difficult questions. Do we still need this much parking? Who does it really serve? What could this land become instead? But change is slow. Because parking is not just infrastructure, it is culture. In the next part, we will explore what happens when cities begin to challenge parking itself, how some American cities are removing parking minimums, how others are converting parking lots into housing, parks, and public spaces, and why the future of American cities may depend on what replaces the parking lot. The culture of the car. How parking became a way of life. By the mid-20th century, parking lots were no longer just a technical solution. They had become a cultural symbol. To understand why American cities are surrounded by parking, we must understand one core truth. The United States did not simply adopt the car. The car reshaped American identity. In many countries, cars are transportation tools. In America, the car became freedom, status, and independence. And cities were redesigned to serve that idea. The automobile as freedom. After World War II, the United States experienced unprecedented economic growth. Millions of returning soldiers wanted homes, jobs, and a better life. Cars offered all three. With a car, Americans could live farther from work, own private homes instead of apartments, escape crowded urban centers, control their time and movement. Driving symbolized personal freedom. This belief became deeply embedded in American culture. Cities responded by making driving easier and parking essential. Suburban life and the parking expectation. As suburbans expanded, a new assumption took hold. Every destination must have parking. Shopping malls, schools, churches, hospitals, offices, restaurants. Parking was no longer optional. It was expected. Developers who failed to provide parking lost customers. Businesses without parking were considered inaccessible. This expectation spread back into cities. Urban land was sacrificed to meet suburban habits. Parking as a business necessity. By the 1950s and 60s, city planners and business owners believed something dangerous. If we remove parking, people will stop coming. Downtowns demolished buildings to add parking. Historic neighborhoods were cleared for surface lots. Entire blocks disappeared. The irony: many of these areas became less attractive. But at the time, parking was seen as economic oxygen. Without it, cities feared death.
Zoning laws locked parking in place. Parking did not grow naturally. It was mandated. Minimum parking requirements became standard across American cities. For example, 1 space per apartment unit, 1 space per certain square footage of retail, multiple spaces per restaurant seat. These rules applied everywhere, regardless of location, transit access, or walkability. Once built, parking became permanent. Removing it later required political battles, zoning changes, and public resistance. Thus, parking lots multiplied. Parking and racial and economic divides. Parking also played a hidden role in social separation. Highways and parking structures often replaced minority neighborhoods, low-income housing, historic communities. Cars allowed wealthier residents to live farther away, while urban cores were hollowed out. Parking supported this separation by prioritizing commuters over residents. Cities were shaped for vehicles passing through, not people living there. The psychology of convenience. Over time, Americans became conditioned. Distance felt unacceptable. Walking felt inconvenient. Transit felt slow or unsafe. Parking close to the destination became a perceived right. Even when alternatives existed, habits remained. Parking shaped behavior, and behavior shaped cities. Why parking never felt temporary? Unlike other infrastructure, parking rarely feels obsolete. Roads evolve. Buildings change use. But parking stays. Why? Because it represents convenience, predictability, familiarity. Removing parking feels like removing freedom, even when evidence shows otherwise. This emotional attachment makes reform difficult. The result? Cities built for cars, not people. By the late 20th century, many American cities had become spread out, disconnected, dominated by asphalt, hostile to walking. Parking consumed enormous amounts of land, often more than housing itself. In some cities, there are more parking spaces than people. This is not an accident. It is the result of decades of cultural belief, policy decisions, and economic fear. But here is the critical question. Is this system actually working? Are parking-heavy cities healthier, wealthier, and more livable? Or did the solution become the problem? In the next part, we will examine the hidden costs of parking: economic, environmental, and social, and why many American cities are now questioning everything they once believed.
The hidden costs of parking lot cities. Urban, social, economic, and environmental consequences. For decades, parking lots were treated as neutral infrastructure. Empty spaces, quiet asphalt, something no one questioned. But over time, urban researchers, architects, and city planners began to realize something unsettling. Parking did not just support cities, it reshaped them. And the cost of that transformation was far greater than anyone expected. Cities designed for cars, not people. When parking requirements expanded, cities changed their priorities. Land was no longer shaped by human movement, it was shaped by vehicle storage. Buildings moved farther apart, blocks grew larger, walking distances increased. What once felt like a connected urban fabric became fragmented. Sidewalks led nowhere, street life disappeared, public spaces shrank. In many American cities, the most dominant architectural feature is not a building at all, it is emptiness. Cities became collections of destinations, not experiences. You drive, you park, you leave. The city is no longer something you inhabit, it is something you pass through. The economic cost of free parking. Parking often feels free, but economically it never is. Every parking space costs money to build, maintain, and enforce.
Surface parking is cheaper than garages, but still expensive when multiplied at scale. In dense cities, a single parking space can cost $5,000 to $10,000 for surface lots, $25,000 to $60,000 for structured parking, even more for underground garages. Those costs do not disappear. They are passed on through higher rents, higher housing prices, higher retail prices, higher taxes. Even people who do not own cars pay for parking, indirectly. Parking is not free, it is simply hidden, and in American cities, the hidden subsidy is massive. Parking and the housing crisis. One of the most damaging impacts of parking policy has been on housing. For decades, zoning codes required new housing to include a minimum number of parking spaces. One apartment often required one parking space, sometimes two. This requirement dramatically increased construction costs. Developers had to build garages instead of homes. Land that could hold housing was consumed by asphalt. In many cities, parking requirements made affordable housing financially impossible. Even when demand for parking was low, the law required it. The result? Fewer housing units, higher rents, slower urban growth. Parking did not just take space from cities, it took space from people. The environmental impact of asphalt cities. Parking lots have a direct environmental cost. Asphalt absorbs heat. Large paved areas create urban heat islands. Cities with extensive surface parking are often several degrees hotter than surrounding areas. This leads to increased energy use, higher air conditioning demand, worsened air quality. Rainwater cannot penetrate asphalt. Instead of soaking into the ground, water runs off into drains, carrying oil, chemicals, and debris into rivers. Flooding becomes more severe. Ecosystems are damaged. Parking lots may look empty, but environmentally, they are extremely loud. Social isolation and the loss of public life. Historically, cities were social machines. Markets, streets, plazas. Parking disrupted the social fabric. Large lots separate buildings from streets. They break eye contact between people. They eliminate casual encounters. When everything requires driving, spontaneous interaction disappears. You do not meet neighbors in parking lots. You do not linger. You do not talk. Urban life becomes private, not shared. This has long-term social effects. Weaker community bonds, increased isolation, reduced civic engagement. Parking changed not just how cities look, but how people relate to one another. Why these costs were ignored for so long? If parking caused so many problems, why did it continue for decades? Because the costs were invisible. Parking decisions were made one project at a time. One building, one lot, one code revision. No one saw the full picture. And culturally, the car was untouchable. To question parking was to question freedom, growth, and prosperity. Politically, removing parking was risky. Drivers were voters, and parking felt personal. So cities kept adding asphalt, even as the damage accumulated. The turning point in urban thinking. By the late 20th and early 21st century, a shift began. Urban economists, transportation researchers, architects and planners. They started asking a dangerous question. What if parking is the problem? Studies revealed that many parking spaces sat empty most of the time. Demand was overestimated. Parking minimums distorted land use. Cities realized they had been planning for peak car use, not everyday life. And slowly, the foundation of parking policy began to crack. Parking lots are not passive infrastructure. They actively shape cities.
They influence urban form, housing affordability, environmental health, social life, economic efficiency. American cities did not choose empty space by accident. They were designed into it. And once cities understood the true cost of parking, the next question became inevitable. Can cities undo this damage?
The culture of parking. How America learned to love empty space. By the mid-20th century, parking lots were no longer just infrastructure. They had become culture. In the United States, the presence of parking came to symbolize freedom, convenience, and modern life. And over time, Americans didn't just tolerate parking lots, they expected them. To understand why American cities have so many parking lots today, we must understand how parking became emotionally and culturally normal. Parking as a symbol of freedom. For generations of Americans, the automobile represented independence. It meant leaving small towns, choosing where to live, traveling without schedules, escaping density and crowding. Parking was inseparable from that freedom. A destination without parking felt incomplete. A store without parking felt unwelcoming.
A city without parking felt hostile. This expectation slowly rewired how Americans experienced space. In many places, access mattered more than place. The psychology of convenience. Parking lots solved a psychological problem. They removed friction. No searching. No walking far. No uncertainty. In post-war America, convenience became a core value of daily life. Shopping centers advertised ample free parking as aggressively as they advertised low prices. In this system, distance became invisible. Land became secondary. Space felt unlimited. The parking lot acted as a buffer between people and the city itself. Parking and consumer behavior. Retail followed parking. Big box stores, malls, and supermarkets were designed around cars, not people. Buildings were pushed back. Entrances faced asphalt. Walking was minimized. In many American cities, the parking lot became larger than the building it served. This design wasn't accidental. Studies showed customers stayed longer when parking was easy. Spending increased when access felt effortless. Complaints dropped when parking was abundant. Parking became a competitive advantage. And cities reinforced this model. The invisible cost of normalization. As parking became normal, its cost became invisible. Few people noticed. How much land was consumed? How much housing was displaced? How many businesses became unwalkable? Parking lots looked neutral. They felt empty, harmless, temporary. But they were permanent. Each parking lot locked a city into a low-density future. Once built, it was difficult to reverse. How parking shaped daily life. Over time, parking influenced how Americans moved, planned, and interacted. Children stopped walking to school. Errands required driving. Social life became destination-based, not neighborhood-based. Cities became a collection of isolated points connected by roads and parking. Public space shrank. Street life weakened. Urban intensity faded. Parking didn't just support cars. It reorganized life around them. Why empty space feels right. In many American cities, an empty parking lot doesn't feel strange. It feels safe, predictable, controlled. Density, by contrast, often feels unfamiliar or uncomfortable. This emotional response matters, because planning decisions are rarely just technical. They are cultural. And for decades, American culture equated space with quality. Parking lots delivered space. The feedback loop. Once parking became expected, cities had little choice. More parking encouraged more driving. More driving required more parking. This created a feedback loop that reinforced itself over generations. Even when cities wanted change, resistance appeared. Business owners feared losing customers. Residents feared losing access. Politicians feared backlash. Parking had become untouchable. A culture built on assumptions. The result is a landscape built on assumptions. Everyone drives. Land is cheap. Space is unlimited. Convenience comes first. These assumptions shaped zoning, investment, and urban form. And they explain why American cities today contain so much parking, far more than any other nation on Earth. But culture can change. And in recent decades, a new generation of planners, architects, and cities has begun to question the role of parking. What happens when cities challenge these assumptions? What happens when parking is removed? That story begins next.
The culture of parking, how empty space became normal. By this point in the story, one question becomes unavoidable. Why do Americans barely notice parking lots anymore? They are everywhere. They dominate city centers, suburbs, shopping districts, stadiums, offices, schools, even churches. Yet for most people, they feel invisible. This is not an accident. It is cultural conditioning. Parking as a promise of freedom. In the United States, parking is not just infrastructure. It is a promise. A promise that you can arrive whenever you want. A promise that distance does not matter. A promise that convenience is guaranteed. From a young age, Americans are taught that mobility equals freedom, and mobility means driving. Parking is the silent partner of that ideology. A building without parking feels incomplete, suspicious, unwelcoming. When people see a place with no parking, the reaction is rarely curiosity. It is frustration. Where am I supposed to park? This question reveals something deeper. It shows how thoroughly parking has been embedded into everyday expectations. How zoning taught people to expect parking. For decades, zoning laws required parking everywhere: apartments, offices, restaurants, gyms, even small corner shops. This created a powerful feedback loop. Developers built parking because the law required it. People got used to parking being available. Cities assumed people would drive. Transit became less viable. Driving became more necessary. Over time, parking stopped feeling like a choice. It felt like a right, a basic service like water or electricity. The psychology of convenience. Parking lots are designed around one emotional goal: reducing friction. No searching, no uncertainty, no waiting. The moment friction appears, people feel stressed. This is why parking lots are wide, flat, repetitive, and oversized. They are not meant to be interesting. They are meant to be predictable. Predictability feels safe, and safety creates loyalty. This psychological comfort is one reason parking remains politically powerful. Any attempt to remove parking is framed as taking something away. Not space, not land, but comfort. Why parking feels neutral, but is not. Parking lots feel neutral because they appear empty. No buildings, no people, no obvious activity. But emptiness is not neutral. It is a design choice with consequences. Every parking lot represents land that could have been housing, land that could have been jobs, land that could have been parks, land that could have been tax revenue. When cities normalize emptiness, they normalize inefficiency. And when inefficiency becomes normal, it stops being questioned. Media, movies, and the normalization of parking. Look closely at American movies and television. Driveways, parking garages, wide streets, big box stores surrounded by asphalt. These images repeat endlessly. They shape expectations. A city with narrow streets and limited parking feels foreign, even threatening, to audiences raised on these visuals. Parking becomes part of the cultural backdrop, not something to debate, something to assume. How parking shapes behavior without notice. Parking quietly shapes how people move. When parking is free and abundant, people drive farther, people walk less. Short trips become car trips. This reduces street life, reduces casual interaction, reduces economic activity at the human scale. Cities become places you move through, not places you linger. And because this shift happens slowly, it feels natural. The silent cost of normalization. Perhaps the most powerful effect of parking culture is what it prevents. When cities assume driving is inevitable, they stop imagining alternatives. Public transit feels unrealistic. Dense housing feels impossible. Walkability feels optional. Parking freezes cities in a single mode of thinking, one where space is sacrificed so cars can rest, even when people cannot afford to live nearby. A culture built for cars, not people. American cities did not choose parking lots because they loved empty space. They chose them because they prioritized movement over place, speed over experience, convenience over community, access over interaction. Parking lots are the physical expression of those values: wide, efficient, emotionless. And once those values are embedded in culture, changing them becomes incredibly difficult. Why this matters now? Today, cities face new pressures: housing shortages, climate change, economic inequality, infrastructure decay. Parking lots sit at the center of all of it. They are land reserves hiding in plain sight. But unlocking that land requires changing not just policy, but expectations. And expectations are the hardest thing to redesign. Key idea for narration emphasis. Parking lots exist not just because of laws or cars, but because American culture learned to see empty space as normal, necessary, and desirable.
And once a city learns that lesson, it builds it everywhere. The future of parking and the fate of American cities. For nearly a century, parking has shaped American cities more than most people realize. It determined how far buildings sit from the street, how wide roads became, how dense neighborhoods were allowed to be, and ultimately, how Americans live, move, and interact with each other. But today, the parking era is quietly entering a crisis. Not because people stopped driving, but because the system that built cities around parking is becoming unsustainable. The invisible cost of parking in the modern city. Parking lots appear empty, simple, harmless. But economically, they are one of the least productive land uses in any city. A downtown block covered by offices, housing, or shops generates jobs, tax revenue, street activity, economic circulation. The same block turned into parking produces almost no jobs, minimal tax revenue, no street life, no long-term value. Cities maintain roads, lighting, drainage, policing, and enforcement for parking areas that barely pay for themselves.
In many U.S. cities, the land value lost to parking reaches billions of dollars annually. Parking looks neutral, but financially, it drains cities quietly and constantly. The parking paradox. Here is the paradox of American parking. Cities require parking to support cars, but parking itself creates more car dependency. More parking spreads destinations farther apart, weakens public transit, discourages walking, increases traffic, which then leads to demands for more parking. This self-reinforcing cycle locked American cities into car dependency for decades. Breaking that cycle requires changing not behavior, but rules. The rise of parking reform. In the last 15 years, something unprecedented began to happen. American cities started removing parking requirements, not limiting parking, not regulating it differently, but eliminating mandatory minimums entirely. Cities like Buffalo, Minneapolis, Sauzet, Portland, Austin recognized a key truth. Parking demand is not fixed, it is created by policy. When parking is optional, developers build less of it, housing becomes cheaper, land gets reused, neighborhoods become denser and more walkable. Parking does not disappear, it simply becomes market-driven instead of rule-driven.
What happens when parking goes away? When cities reduce parking mandates, several changes follow. First, buildings get closer to the street. Urban fabric becomes continuous again. Second, smaller projects become viable. Local developers can build without massive parking costs. Third, housing prices stabilize or fall because parking is no longer baked into rent. Fourth, streets become active. Ground floors face people, not cars. And most importantly, cities regain flexibility. Parking stops being the default land use. Parking lots as opportunity land. Across the United States, parking lots represent one of the largest untapped urban resources. Surface parking lots are flat, centrally located, already paved, already serviced by infrastructure. Urban planners call them opportunity land. They can become housing, offices, parks, schools, mixed-use developments. Some cities are already transforming parking lots into entire neighborhoods. What once stored cars is now storing human life again. The automation question. Another force is quietly reshaping parking's future: automation. Self-driving vehicles, even in limited form, reduce parking demand. A car that can drop you off and leave does not need to sit downtown all day. Ride-hailing already reduced parking needs in certain areas. Autonomous fleets could accelerate that trend dramatically. Cities built for parked cars may soon find themselves with vast empty asphalt fields. The question is not whether parking will decline. The question is how cities will respond when it does. Why American cities look the way they do and what comes next. American cities did not fail. They followed the rules they were given. Rules written in the age of oil, highways, and automobiles. Rules that assumed infinite land, infinite growth, and infinite driving. Parking lots are not a mistake. They are the physical record of American priorities. But priorities change. Cities are now rediscovering density, proximity, walkability, public life. Not by copying Europe, but by undoing policies that made alternatives illegal. Parking shaped American cities more than architecture, planners, or culture ever did. It decided where buildings could stand, how neighborhoods could grow, who cities were designed for. Understanding parking is understanding American urban history. And rethinking parking may be the key to rebuilding American cities for the future. This is not just about cars. It is about space, economics, freedom, and what cities choose to value. For decades, parking lots have quietly shaped American cities, not because people demanded them, but because laws, economics, and design decisions decades ago forced cities to build for cars instead of people. What looks normal today, endless asphalt, empty spaces, oversized parking, is actually one of the most powerful planning decisions in modern urban history. And now, cities across the United States are starting to question it. Some are removing parking minimums. Some are turning lots into housing, parks, and walkable neighborhoods. Others are still doubling down on car-first design.
So here's the real question, and this is where I want to hear from you. Do you think parking lots are a necessary part of American life, or a massive mistake that cities will regret for generations? And if you live in the US, look around your city. How much land is wasted on parking where you live? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them all, and the best discussions shape future videos on this channel. This is architecture history, and this is how cities are shaped, one decision at a time. If you live in the United States, look around your city. How much land is used for parking? And here's the real question. If that parking disappeared tomorrow, what would you want built there instead? Housing? Parks? Public spaces? Or something else? Write your answer in the comments.